I had a dish towel twisted in my hands when I heard my father give away my condo like it was an old couch nobody wanted. The kitchen was warm with nutmeg, baked ham, and coffee. On the other side of the wall in the dining room, Harold Lawson lifted his voice so every cousin, aunt, and neighbor could hear him announce that my home would become a Christmas surprise for my sister's family. A safe place for the kids. A fresh beginning after the holidays. Nobody had asked me one question. I owned that condo. I had paid every cent myself. And still I stood there, drying a plate, listening to my parents donate the only place in the world that had ever been completely mine. So I walked back in, smiled at the table, clapped with everybody else, and started planning the one move none of them believed I was capable of making. Welcome back to Dull Pain Stories. My name is Emily Lawson. I was 37 when my family decided my life was something they could vote on without inviting me into the room. This is what happened when they promised my home to my younger sister, and how I made sure no one in that house ever confused my silence for permission again. Every year, I drove to my parents' place on Christmas afternoon with dessert buckled into the passenger seat and a folded check tucked inside my purse. The dessert changed. Pecan pie one year, apple crumble the next, lemon cake if my mother had already made enough heavy food. The check never changed. It was always for something my father had let slide. A hospital balance, a roof repair, property taxes that had become an emergency because he had ignored the letters until the final notice came. For a long time, I told myself I was helping. Then helping became expected, and expected became my position in the family. I was the practical daughter, the bookkeeper, the one with the steady hands and the extra money. If the furnace gave out, they called me before the repairman. If Grace Lawson forgot to renew the insurance, I fixed it. If my sister Natalie Brooks and her husband Jason came up short again, somehow that shortfall landed in my lap too. I did not know how to say no without feeling as though I had broken something sacred. That was the weakness they had all learned to lean on. My parents still lived in the low brick house where I had grown up, at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac outside a small town in Ohio. The yard looked smaller every year, but the porch still had the chipped step where my grandfather once sat with me during thunderstorms. When I turned into the driveway that Christmas, there were too many vehicles parked out front. Natalie's SUV, my cousin's pickup, Aunt Donna Miller's blue hatchback, and a tall gray moving van sitting across from the house with its hazards off. I slowed down when I saw it. Nobody moved during Christmas week, not on a street where half the neighbors had plastic deer in their yards and too much food in their kitchens. For a second, I wondered if somebody nearby was clearing out an estate. Then I told myself I was tired. I parked behind Natalie's SUV, balanced the cake, and went up the porch steps. My mother opened before I could knock a second time. She hugged me hard, kissed near my ear, and said, almost trembling with excitement, "Your dad is going to make everyone cry tonight." I laughed because I thought she meant something sweet. A family story. A surprise gift. Maybe Jason had found work, or Natalie was finally going back to school, or one of the kids had won something. I wanted it to be good. That was another habit of mine, making hope out of scraps and handing it to everyone else. Dinner started normally enough. There were 13 people at a table meant for 9. Chairs dragged in from bedrooms, elbows bumping, bread passed over heads. My father sat at one end with that proud, secretive expression he wore whenever he believed he had arranged something important. My mother kept glancing at him and smiling into her napkin. Halfway through the meal, he tapped the side of his glass with a spoon and said there would be a special announcement after dessert. Natalie looked at Jason from across the table. Jason smirked down at his plate. Their children, Lily and Owen, kept guessing. A dog, a trip, a trampoline. I smiled with them. I truly did. I thought maybe Jason had gotten a contract after his remodeling business collapsed in October. Maybe they had found a cheaper rental. Maybe my parents were finally ready to sell the house and move into something smaller. Then Jason leaned close while my mother was refilling drinks and asked, very casually, whether the rules at my condo building allowed someone to rent out a unit to relatives. The question landed wrong. I told him I owned my unit free and clear, so building rules mattered less than my decision. Then I asked about his job search because I did not want to turn dinner into an interrogation. Jason nodded as if I had just confirmed a detail he needed. Natalie smiled at the mashed potatoes. My mother carried coffee cups into the kitchen with a lightness I had not seen in her for months. I told myself again that families were nosy. I told myself the van outside had nothing to do with me. After dessert, I did what I always did. I gathered plates, stacked forks, and carried the first load into the kitchen. The dining room shared a thin wall with the sink. If people spoke softly, you could still catch half a sentence. That was where my evening split into before and after. Before you understand why I froze over the sink, you need to understand what that condo meant to me. I bought it when I was 31. I had spent nearly 12 years saving for it. During college, I worked payroll for a supply warehouse in the mornings and served tables at a diner 3 nights a week. I drove a rusted sedan with a heater that only worked on the passenger side. I skipped vacations. I patched my own shoes once because rent was due and I could not miss it. My grandfather Arthur Lawson was the first person who made me believe ownership could change the way a person breathed. When I was 22, and no landlord wanted a tenant with student debt and no credit history, he signed my first apartment lease with me. Afterward, we sat in a booth at a roadside cafe, and he pushed his coffee aside to look at me properly. "Put one thing in your name someday," he told me. "Not borrowed, not shared, not depending on anyone's mood. Something nobody else gets to decide about." I carried that sentence like a charm. Every raise I received went mostly into savings. Bonuses disappeared into an account I never touched. I watched home listings for years. When I finally found a 2-bedroom condo with wide windows, a narrow balcony, and sunlight that spilled across the floor every morning, I made an offer with shaking hands. At closing, I signed a loan. No husband beside me, no parent co-signing, no family vote. Emily Lawson, sole owner. I painted the hallway myself. I learned how to fix the disposal after watching 3 videos. I changed the cabinet hardware on a Sunday and felt ridiculous for crying when it was finished. That condo was not just real estate. It was proof that the daughter who kept everyone else's life running could build one corner of the world that belonged only to her. My family came to the housewarming, ate my food, admired the balcony, and said they were proud. Somewhere after that, without saying it out loud, they changed the meaning of the place. To them it became extra space, a family backup plan, a resource sitting unused because I was single and supposedly needed so little. I did not know they had decided that until I stood in my parents' kitchen with dish soap on my fingers and heard my mother discussing my bedroom layout as if she were rearranging a guest room. Grace Lawson was talking to Natalie in a soft, pleased voice. She said Lily could have the room with the morning window, and Owen could take the other side after they put in bunk beds. She said Jason could use the dining nook for paperwork until he got back on his feet. She said moving them in during the first week of January would give the children time to adjust before classes resumed in the better district. For a few seconds, I could not make the words belong to one another. They were talking about my condo, my floor, my balcony, my little proof of survival. Then my mother said the sentence that closed every door inside me. She said, "Emily will understand. She doesn't need 2 bedrooms, it's only her." Only her, as though being one person made my life less real. As though the rooms I had paid for were portions on a plate, and decency required me to slide the bigger half toward my sister. I placed the plates on the counter one by one so carefully that not one of them clicked. My hands were calm, which surprised me. I thought rage would come hot and messy. Instead, something colder arrived. The stillness before a hard freeze. In that moment, I understood that nobody intended to ask me. The decision was already finished. The only part left was my performance of agreement, because I always agreed. I dried my hands, walked back into the dining room, and found my father already rising from his chair. Harold Lawson lifted his glass and waited until everyone went quiet. He spoke about family pulling together. He said Natalie and Jason had carried too much stress, that the kids needed security, and that grandparents had a duty to make things right when they could. Then he announced that he and my mother had decided to give Natalie's family my condo after the holidays. He described it as a Christmas blessing, a real home, and a practical solution all at once. He said it like a man handing out land from his own estate. Every face turned toward me, because every person in that room knew on some level that the condo was mine. Natalie already had tears shining on her cheeks. Lily and Owen were squealing. Jason watched me with his arm around my sister, and there was nothing humble in his expression. It was a challenge. My father lifted his glass toward me and said, "That's settled now." Settled, not offered, not discussed, settled, as if my deed were a minor inconvenience and my signature would arrive because everyone expected it to. I still think about what I did next. I smiled. I raised my glass with the others. I clapped lightly, not too much, not too little. "Well," I said, "that is certainly a holiday surprise." My mother beamed at me. My father relaxed, certain he had understood me yet again. Natalie mouthed, "Thank you," from across the table. I let her believe whatever she wanted, because I knew the trap had been built perfectly. If I protested in front of the children, I would become the selfish aunt who cared more about empty rooms than family. If I cried, I would prove I was emotional. If I shouted, I would become unreasonable. They had staged it publicly so my decency would do the work of my consent. So I did not give them the scene they wanted. I clapped. I smiled. And somewhere behind my eyes, I began adding numbers. I drove home that night with both hands on the wheel and my thoughts moving faster than the road. I expected tears. They never came. Instead, I made a list. That is what accountants do when feelings become too large. We turn them into columns. On one side, every check, every late bill, every tax form, every rescue, the emergency furnace, the medical balance, Jason's overdraft in May, Natalie's rent when the landlord threatened to file. On the other side, a room full of people giving away my home because they believed my usefulness was more important than my ownership. They had not asked because asking would have forced them to admit I could say no. In their minds, the condo already belonged to the family, and I was merely the account where it had been parked until someone with children needed it more. The ugliest part was not that they thought that. It was that I had helped teach them. Every time I rescued them without complaint, I had reinforced the idea that my boundaries were decorative. Every time I paid and smiled and swallowed the resentment, I had made it easier for them to forget there was a person attached to the money. I was not going to argue with them around a holiday table. That was their stage, and they had filled the seats. But I had my own arena. Paperwork, ownership, deadlines, signatures, clean math. By the time I pulled into the parking spot beneath my balcony, I had remembered an email I had ignored nearly a year earlier. The morning after Christmas, I woke up to a message from Natalie and a photo that turned my first sip of coffee sour. The message said, "Em, we can't thank you enough. The kids are over the moon." The picture showed Lily and Owen standing on the sidewalk outside my building, pointing toward my windows as if they were already choosing who got what. Jason had driven them over that morning to look at their future home. Before I could set the phone down, another message arrived. Natalie asked whether I could be out by January 18 because the school term restarted on the 22nd and they needed a few days to unpack. Be out. She wrote it as if I were a tenant receiving notice from my own sister. I placed the phone face up on the counter, finished making coffee, and drank it slowly while the screen kept glowing. I was not paralyzed. I was choosing. Part of me wanted to call and tell her every fact at full volume. That our parents had promised her walls they did not own. That her children were standing outside a building they had no claim to. That the word grateful had no place in a theft dressed up as generosity. But the dinner had taught me something useful. The first person to get loud would lose. Natalie would cry, Jason would talk about the kids, my parents would accuse me of being hard, and everyone would remember my tone instead of their entitlement. So I wrote only, "We should talk after the holidays." Then I opened my laptop and searched my inbox for a name, Calvin Pierce. Before I made the call, I gave my parents one honest chance. Not because they deserved it exactly, because I wanted to know that I had tried. On December 27, I drove back to their house and sat at the same kitchen table where my future had been discussed without me. My mother poured tea. My father folded his arms. I spoke plainly. I told them the condo was mine. I reminded them that my name was the only name on the deed. I said I had bought it with my own savings, had paid it off, and had never agreed to give it to anyone. I did not raise my voice. I was not there to win an argument. I was there to offer them a way back to reality. My father stared at the table and said I was turning a family matter into a financial issue. My mother touched my wrist and told me not to be small about this. She said Natalie needed the place more than I did. She said the children needed stability. She said I was still young, unmarried, and talented enough to buy somewhere else later. She said it kindly. That kindness was the last thing I needed to understand. She did not think she was taking anything. In her mind, my home was available because another branch of the family was hurting. To her, the wrong thing was not giving away my condo. The wrong thing was my refusal to be generous with it. I looked at both of them and realized facts would never open this door. They had built an entire worldview in which I existed to absorb pressure. My comfort was invisible because I had taught them never to look for it. So I stopped explaining. If you have ever sat across from people who love you and discovered that love does not make them hear you, you know the special loneliness of that moment. I sat in it. I let it harden into something useful. Finally, I said I would think it over. My father nodded, satisfied. My mother squeezed my hand, already forgiving me for a surrender I had not made. I drove home to make arrangements. Jason appeared at my condo that evening without warning. When I opened the door, he stood in the hallway wearing a canvas work jacket, a tape measure clipped to his belt, with the same gray moving van idling near the curb below. He had apparently reserved it for January 2. He asked if he could measure the smaller bedroom for the children's beds. I did not step aside. At first, he acted friendly. He said my dad had told him everything was handled. He said he knew transitions could be awkward. He said it would be easier for everyone if I let him take a few measurements now. I told him there would be no measuring because he was not moving into my condo. His smile fell away. He told me his business had failed because clients had backed out. He said creditors called him while his kids were eating dinner. He said their current apartment had mold near the bathroom window and no room for the kids to breathe. He said this condo was the one good thing his family had been offered in months. I believed him. That is what made it hurt. Then he ruined any sympathy by saying, "The family already decided. You got outvoted." Outvoted, on the place with my name on the deed. For 1 second, I almost told him what I was planning. I wanted to see his face change. I wanted the satisfaction of saying he was measuring air. But a loud victory would have been temporary, and I wanted something permanent. So I told him to take the van and the tape measure home. He leaned closer and said I was going to regret making enemies out of the people who loved me. I closed the door in his face. Through the wood, I heard him mutter that I would come around. I stood there in my own entryway and almost laughed. Coming around was exactly what I was done doing. That night, I sat on the living room floor with my laptop open and found Calvin Pierce's old email. Calvin was a local property investor who had contacted several owners in my building 11 months earlier. He wanted units to turn into furnished rentals for traveling nurses and consultants. Most of the owners ignored him. I had answered politely because I hate leaving emails hanging. His offer had been direct: cash purchase, quick closing, no inspection delays beyond the standard review. The number was not as high as I might have gotten with months of showings, but it was real and strong enough to make me remember it. At the time, I had declined. I loved my place. I had no reason to sell. Now I read the thread again. At the bottom, he had written, "If you ever reconsider, the offer remains open subject to market conditions." I stared at those words for a long time. Selling would hurt. I will not pretend otherwise. That condo held my mornings, my quiet, my proof. It held the version of me who had believed a locked door and a deed could protect her from other people's claims. But my family had shown me what they would do as long as the condo existed. They would treat it as emergency storage for somebody else's crisis. Every setback would circle back to my square footage. Every future refusal would make me cruel again. There was one way to remove it from the family board entirely. Sell it. Make it unavailable to all of us. Turn their promised gift into something they could not touch. You cannot hand over a house that is no longer yours to discuss. I saved Calvin's number to my phone, but I did not call immediately. I needed one legal answer first. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney named Renee Cole. I had helped her clean up 2 years of messy bookkeeping after her assistant quit, and she had once told me to call if I ever needed a favor. When she answered, I asked the only question that mattered. If I was the sole owner on a paid-off condo, could my parents or sister block a sale? Renee laughed once, not unkindly. Emily, if your name is the only name on the deed, nobody else has a vote. You can sell it today, tomorrow, or to the first stranger with a cashier's check. I asked how fast a cash closing could happen. She said if the title was clean and the buyer was serious, it could be done in 5 or 6 business days, sometimes sooner. With pressure and a good title company, December 31 was possible. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat very still. Then the second piece of my life clicked into place. 2 weeks earlier, my firm had offered me a transfer to Denver. Senior role, better salary, larger clients, and a chance to rebuild in a city where nobody expected me to be the family emergency department. I had been ready to decline. I told myself my parents needed me nearby. Natalie needed help. The kids needed their aunt. Someone had to make sure bills got paid and calls got answered. Now, sitting with Renee's words in my ears and Natalie's messages on my phone, the hesitation dissolved. There was no family structure to hold together. There was only a structure holding me in place. I could sell the condo, take the Denver job, and leave before they could turn their assumptions into another public performance. All I had to do was move faster than the people who thought I would never move at all. I wish I could say I felt certain from that moment. I didn't. That evening, I sat on my bedroom floor beside a box I had carried through 3 apartments and never fully unpacked. Inside were the little remains of my 20s. A bent graduation tassel, an old movie ticket, a photo of Arthur Lawson squinting into the sun, the first apartment lease he had signed with me, and a silver watch that stopped the year he died. I held those things and doubted everything. This was still my family. My mother had stayed up sewing my Halloween costumes when we had no money for store-bought ones. My father had taught me to drive in an empty school parking lot, one hand on the dashboard as if he could stop the car by force. Natalie had been the girl in the bottom bunk whispering secrets to me after lights out. Selling my condo and leaving felt huge. It felt harsh. It felt like choosing a kind of door that might lock behind me. I asked myself whether I was being cruel to the children, whether a kinder sister would compromise, whether a better daughter would sacrifice a little comfort for peace. Then I reached the bottom of the box and found the blue folder. I had not opened it since the month I bought my condo. Arthur had given it to me after closing. I remembered him placing it in my hands, saying important papers deserved a home of their own. I was so overwhelmed at the time that I barely noticed what he had written across the front. Now I saw it under the bedroom lamp. His handwriting, blocky and careful, filled 3 words. Emily's. No vote. I opened the folder slowly. Inside was a copy of the deed. I read every line as if I were studying proof in court. Grantor, grantee, legal description, unit number. And on the line that mattered, Emily R. Lawson, sole owner, not Harold Lawson, not Grace Lawson, not Natalie Brooks, not the Lawson family. One name, mine. I ran my finger beneath the line. 6 years I had owned that condo, and my family had treated the name as if it were a clerical detail. It was not a detail. It was the fact everything else had to answer to. County recorded, stamped, filed, Real. Then I looked again at Arthur's note. Emily's, no vote. He had understood something long before I did. He had lost his father's little house when relatives pressured a widow into signing papers she did not understand. Maybe that was why he cared so much about ownership. Maybe he had feared I would someday face a room full of people explaining why my own name should matter less than their need. He had left me a sentence for precisely that night. I cried then, quietly and without drama. Not because the answer became easy, but because it became solid. The condo was mine to keep, sell, rent, lock, or leave empty. It had never been part of a family ballot. I put the deed back in the folder and placed it on my nightstand where I could see it. Then I called Calvin Pierce. Calvin answered on the third ring. I told him my name, my unit number, and that if his offer was still available, I was prepared to sell quickly. For a moment there was silence. Then his voice sharpened with interest. He said he still wanted the unit. In fact, he could improve the old price a little because inventory in the building had tightened. He asked what had changed. I said my circumstances had shifted and I wanted a clean cash deal. He liked that. Investors always like clean. Within 10 minutes, we had agreed on a price. $382,000, cash, no financing, standard title review. He said his title company could open the file the next morning. If nothing odd appeared, we could close on December 31. I said yes in the same tone I used to confirm appointments. Inside, something broke and steadied at the same time. After we hung up, he texted me his attorney's information. I forwarded everything to Renee and asked her to review every line, every date, every disclosure, and every signature. I wanted no gap wide enough for my father to put a grievance through. Renee answered, "Send it all. I'll lock it down." And just like that, the machinery began. Quietly. Legally. 3 days before a New Year's Eve dinner where my father planned to place a ceremonial key in my sister's hand. The next several days felt unreal because my outside life remained ordinary while the foundation underneath it shifted. I worked. I answered client emails. I went grocery shopping. I packed slowly, one cabinet at a time. My phone filled with family messages, and I refused to pour fuel on any of them. Escrow opened. The title company searched the records and confirmed what the deed had already told me. No liens, no mortgage, no hidden owner. One clean title in one name. Calvin's attorney sent the purchase agreement. I read every page twice because I have always been the person who reads every page twice. This time that habit felt like armor. I signed disclosures. Renee asked questions. Calvin answered quickly. The title officer scheduled the closing for 10:30 on the morning of December 31. There were ordinary little tasks inside the enormous one. I photographed the water heater tag, found the HOA packet in a drawer, emailed proof that dues were current, and answered a question about the balcony railing that made me laugh because nobody in my family had ever cared whether that railing existed until they wanted to lean on it. Renee reminded me not to volunteer explanations to anyone. Calvin reminded his team that speed mattered. The title officer sent neat checklists that turned my grief into boxes to tick. For once, the boxes were mine to tick in the order I chose. The paperwork was not the hardest part. Silence was. My family believed I was angry but softening. Natalie sent paint colors and asked whether I thought the children should have matching curtains. My mother left a voicemail saying she knew I would make the generous choice because I always had a good heart. Jason texted a picture of a bunk bed he found on sale, as if my approval were merely late. Every message assumed the ending. I did not correct them. I did not lie either. I simply stopped participating in the fiction. I answered with short lines when necessary and left most things alone. If you have always been the smoother, the fixer, the one who rushes in before anyone else feels discomfort, silence feels almost violent. It felt like standing in cold water and refusing to reach for the shore. But I was closer to land than they knew. The pressure rose on December 30. Natalie called 3 times before lunch and twice after dinner. When I finally answered, the kids were laughing in the background, and her sweetness had a sharp edge. She asked when she could pick up keys. She said Lily had already told her class she was moving. She asked whether I really wanted to disappoint them. There they were again, the children placed in front of her like furniture she could hide behind. I told her we would talk at New Year's. My voice sounded calm enough that she huffed and hung up. A little later, my mother sent a photo of 2 small lamps she had bought for the kids' rooms. She had spent money she did not have on lamps for a condo she did not own. I stared at the photo for longer than I should have. The anger had thinned by then into grief. These were people I loved. They had walked out onto a branch built from their own assumptions, and warning them now would only make me the villain who ruined the view. They had built this. My only job was to stop holding the ladder. My father did not call at all. That told me more than every message could have. A man who understood my home belonged to me might have checked whether I was okay. Harold Lawson did not wonder. In his mind, the matter was finished, and he was already rehearsing his toast. The only family call I welcomed came that night from Aunt Donna Miller. Donna was my mother's older sister and the kind of woman who could turn a church potluck into a deposition. She did not waste time. "Emily," she said, "are you all right?" The question nearly undid me because it was the first one anyone had asked that did not contain an expectation. She told me my father had been calling relatives and neighbors for days, bragging about the grand gesture. He had invited extra people for New Year's Eve so they could see him hand over the key. Donna said the whole thing felt wrong because she remembered me buying the condo. She remembered the second job, the old car, the years of saving. I thanked her. I did not tell her the plan. I trusted her conscience, not her ability to keep a secret in a family that treated gossip like oxygen. But I did ask whether she would be at dinner. She said yes. Good, I thought. My father had chosen witnesses to applaud him. I needed one witness who knew the truth. The closing took place at 10:30 the next morning in a title office between a dentist and an insurance agency. The lobby smelled like toner, coffee, and winter coats. It took 48 minutes. That is the part that felt impossible. Something that had taken me 12 years to build could transfer in less than an hour because the right papers were signed by the right people. I signed where the flags told me to sign. Calvin signed across from me, friendly and efficient. Renee sat beside me, reading everything one last time before I moved my pen. The title officer stamped the final pages and said the funds should clear before close of business. And then it was done. The condo was no longer mine. I drove back to the building afterward and went inside one last time with a key that had already become temporary. Most of my belongings were in boxes. The rooms echoed softly. Morning light spread across the floor in the same clean stripe it always had, indifferent to grief, paperwork, and family pressure. I let myself feel the loss. I had sold my home, not because my family deserved to push me out, but because I chose the terms under which I would leave. There is a difference between being robbed and deciding what you will no longer guard for people waiting to rob you. Arthur's blue folder was already in my car. I walked through the rooms once, touched the balcony door, and said goodbye to the place that had taught me I could stand alone. Then I locked the door behind me. Calvin would change the locks within days. By the time Jason's moving van showed up on January 2, a new owner would control the buzzer, the key, and every answer. But before that, there was still New Year's Eve. There was still my father's performance. That afternoon, as the sale proceeds arrived in my account, Jason texted again. "Van comes Friday at 8, have the place cleared and bring all keys tomorrow night." He did not ask, he instructed. I read it while standing among packed boxes in a condo I no longer owned. The Denver offer had been accepted in an email I sent that morning. My start date was set. My life had already turned. I did not answer Jason. I could have let the truth find them at the locked front door. I could have skipped dinner, let Jason arrive with a truck and children and discover a stranger's name where mine used to be. Part of me wanted that. But my family had made their claim in a room full of people, so embarrassment would force me into obedience. I decided truth deserved the same room, not because I am above revenge. I am not going to lie about that. There was revenge in it. But mostly I was tired of absorbing private injury while they performed public generosity. I wanted one clear sentence spoken in the exact place where they had tried to erase me. So I dressed carefully. I put the blue folder in my bag. I drove to my parents' house one last time. New Year's Eve was louder than Christmas. My father had invited cousins I usually saw only at weddings, 2 old neighbors, and a couple from his church card group. Streamers hung from the mantel. My mother had set out crystal glasses she normally saved for anniversaries. There was champagne chilling in a silver bucket. Natalie and Jason sat near my father like honored guests. Lily and Owen were wild with soda and anticipation. Jason leaned back with the lazy comfort of a man who believed the keys were already his. I came in quietly, kissed my mother's cheek, and put a tray of stuffed mushrooms on the counter because old habits do not die politely. The folder stayed in my purse. Through dinner, I spoke as little as possible. I watched my father glow. I watched my mother keep touching Natalie's shoulder. I watched Jason check his phone, probably tracking the moving van confirmation. Across the table, Donna caught my eye. Her expression was worried, but she gave me a small nod. After dessert, my father stood and tapped his glass. The room hushed at once. He had trained them well. He spoke about family standing together in hard seasons. He spoke about grandparents leaving something meaningful for the next generation. He spoke about Natalie and Jason needing stability and about children deserving a place to call home. Then he lifted a brass key tied to a red ribbon. It was a prop. I knew it the instant I saw it. Probably cut from some old lock in his garage, bought for the visual, polished for applause. He announced that beginning in January, Natalie's family would move into the condo. He called it his gift to his grandchildren. When he said gift, he looked straight at me. Then he repeated the line from Christmas, the line he believed would shut the room around me. "It's all settled," he said. "The kids have their home." People clapped. Champagne corks started to shift in the ice bucket. Natalie cried the pretty, grateful tears that made everyone lean toward her. Jason reached out and took the ribboned key from my father's hand. Then all eyes came to me. They were waiting for the same Emily they knew, the agreeable aunt, the reliable daughter, the woman who would smile because everyone was watching. I set my napkin beside my plate. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. That was important. People like my father expect volume because then they can argue with tone. Calm forces them to hear words. I waited until the applause faded and the clinking stopped. "Before anyone celebrates too hard," I said, "there is something this room needs to understand." I opened my bag and took out the folder. On the table, beside the champagne glasses, I placed 2 pages. The first was my deed copy with my name highlighted. The second was the closing statement, dated December 31, signed and stamped. I slid them toward my father. "You cannot give away property you never owned," I said. "The condo belonged to me, only me. And as of this morning, it does not belong to me either. I sold it." For one strange second, nobody reacted. The room seemed to lean around the words, looking for another meaning. My father picked up the closing statement. His eyes traveled down the page, past the date, the signatures, the transfer amount, and the final recorded fact. Sold. His face changed by degrees. Natalie stopped crying. Jason set the brass key on the table with a small click. My mother went pale and covered her mouth. I stood still and let the papers do what my voice had never managed to do. All my life, I had tried to explain myself until I ran out of breath. It turned out a stamped document and a date could speak more clearly than I ever had. Then the silence broke. Jason moved first. He shoved back his chair so hard it tipped and crashed behind him. He planted both palms on the table, making the glasses jump, and shouted that I had destroyed his family. He said the children had packed toys. He said the van was paid for. He said I had humiliated everyone just to prove a point. Natalie began sobbing for real, messy and furious, asking how I could be so cold, how I could do this to Lily and Owen, how I could punish them when they had done nothing wrong. The room turned into accusation. Cousins murmured. A neighbor stared into her champagne. Someone whispered my name like it had become a problem. My father finally found his voice and bellowed that I had no right to make a decision that affected the whole family. That was the moment I gave them back the sentence that had started it all. I waited for the shouting to dip, then spoke softly enough that they had to quiet down to hear me. "You all decided I didn't need the space," I said. "You said it was only me." I looked at Natalie, then Jason, then my parents. "Now it is nobody's space, not yours, not mine, nobody here gets it." The room went completely still. Natalie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jason stood purple-faced and breathing hard. My father lowered himself into his chair as though his knees had lost their instructions. I had not screamed. I had not called anyone a thief. I had simply attached math to their own words, and the math was final. Across the table, Donna pressed one hand to her chest. Tears stood in her eyes, but she nodded once. She understood exactly what had happened. My mother was the only one who almost pulled me loose. She did not yell. She looked bewildered and small behind her hand, her eyes wet, and said, "Sweetheart, I thought you were fine. You always seemed fine." There it was, the foundation under everything. Emily is fine. Emily can manage. Emily has extra. Emily will understand. Emily does not need what other people need. My throat tightened, but I did not let the ache turn me around. I looked at my mother and said gently, "That was the problem. You decided I was fine, and then you spent my life like it was spare change." She started to cry. I loved her in that moment. I really did. That love did not change what I had to do. I told her I was finished being the emergency fund. I told the whole table the sale money was mine, my next move was mine, and I had accepted a job in another state. I would be gone within days. "I am still family," I said. "I am not an account you can withdraw from." Then I reached into my coat pocket and took out the spare key to my parents' house. I had carried it for years so I could let myself in when they needed help, check on them, drop medicine off, meet repairmen, and be available at any hour. I set it beside Jason's useless ribboned key. "You can handle things from here," I said. I thanked my mother for dinner because she had cooked it and manners were the last familiar thing left. Then I picked up my folder and walked out. Nobody followed right away. The room was too stunned. As I reached the front door, I heard Donna's voice behind me, clear and steady. "She's right," she said. "I watched that girl buy that place. None of you paid for it." That was the witness I needed. Cold air struck my face as I stepped onto the porch. I got into my car without looking back at the house. I had already seen enough inside it. I left for Denver on January 2 with my car packed tight and Arthur's folder on the passenger seat. 2 hours into the drive, my phone began flashing so often it looked broken. At a gas station near the state line, I checked it once. 66 missed calls. Jason had left threats, then apologies, then more threats. Natalie sent long messages about ruined children without once admitting she had tried to take my home. My father called 5 times and left no voicemail. My mother called the most. I listened to one message. She only said, "Please call me, Emily." I sat in the parking lot, loved her, and still did not call back. The only text I answered was Donna's. "You did what you had to do," she wrote. "Don't let them rewrite it." I typed, "Thank you." Then I turned the phone to silent and drove west.